in which an agreeable game of croquet is interrupted by something decidedly disagreeable, and Lord Peter develops a mild interest in lawns, lacerations, and literary allusions. It was one of those cloudless, golden afternoons which the English summer occasionally produces out of sheer spite, to confound foreign travellers who have packed only macks and sensible woolens. At the country estate of Cliff House in Dorset, the sun fell in wide buttered swathes across clipped hedges and a manicured lawn that had known many a civilized skirmish of mallets and hoops. On this particular Thursday, the Croquet Lawn played host not merely to a polite gathering of mallet-wielding guests, but to something far less agreeable, a woman's scream, sharp, sudden, and altogether ill-suited to the decorum of cucumber sandwiches. It occurred precisely as Lady Prudence Marchbanks bent elegantly, or more accurately, arthritically, to take her shot. The ball, a pale blue one whose trajectory had been the subject of much heated debate, rolled obligingly toward the final hoop, only to be eclipsed by the shriek echoing from the shrubbery on the lawn's eastern edge. Everyone froze, as if frozen was the only thing one could do in such moments. Lady Prudence dropped her mallet, which bounced once on the lawn and came to rest against her sensible shoe. Her nephew, the Honourable Edward Winstanley, recently demobilized, recently unemployed, and recently insufferable, stood rooted, his drink tipping precariously over his wrist. Miss Charity Phipps, a minor poetess and major gossip, dropped her glass entirely. From the hedge emerged Miss Agatha Boothroyd, house-guest and spiritualist, her lace shawl fluttering behind her like a misplaced ghost. She was very pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. One trembling hand pointed behind her into the topiary maze beyond. "There's someone dead, in the croquet pavilion," she said, her voice small and hoarse, as if the scream had stolen all her better vowels. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if remembering their roles in a drawing-room drama, the household stirred. Footmen, previously hovering like well-trained furniture, came to life. Edward dashed forward, performing his first gallant gesture in recent memory. Someone fetched sherry. The housekeeper, Mrs. Denby, whispered something about fainting salts, though whom they were for remained uncertain. Into this tableau of genteel alarm stepped, as if on cue, a tall, fair-haired man in a sand-colored linen suit, whose monocle caught the sun like a bishop's ring, and whose expression was one of vague, amiable interest, as though he had just remembered a particularly clever pun. "Oh, do tell me it's not another poisoned clergyman," said Lord Peter Wimsey, who had arrived not 2 minutes earlier in a borrowed Lagonda, allegedly to collect a rare folio from Sir Everard Marchbanks's library. "I've quite run out of sympathy for dead vicars, though I suppose one could make an exception if the poor fellow had just finished a winning round." "Lord Peter," gasped Miss Boothroyd, recognizing him through a fog of incense and trauma. "It was Mr. Thistlewood. He's lying there, quite still, and the croquet balls are scattered." "Scattered," Wimsey repeated, arching a brow. "That will upset Lady Prudence. She's always been terribly fastidious about the symmetry of sports." He wandered toward the croquet pavilion with a detachment that bordered on irreverence, pausing only to remove his gloves and tuck them into his breast pocket with the casual efficiency of a man who had seen rather too many dead bodies for one lifetime. The croquet pavilion, really more of a glorified gazebo with aspirations toward classical architecture, stood at the far end of the lawn. It was painted white, trimmed in ivy, and boasted a charmingly unnecessary weather vane in the shape of a heron. Inside, reclining on a wicker lounge in an attitude that might have been restful had it not been for the unnatural angle of the neck, was a man of middle years in a well-cut country suit, his throat gruesomely slashed from ear to ear. The blood had soaked into the rush matting, formed a polite pool beneath the chaise, and, in an odd detail Wimsey noted immediately, splattered one corner of a croquet scoreboard which listed Mr. Thistlewood as current champion. A croquet mallet lay nearby, its wooden head smeared with something dark and drying. Yet Whimsy's eyes lingered instead on the teacup resting beside the body, still half full, with a slice of lemon bobbing serenely atop. "Well," he said lightly, turning to face the others, "unless he was exceedingly clumsy in his tea preparation, I should think we might rule out a tragic accident." Sir Everard Marchbanks, baronet, patriarch and collector of obscure Renaissance musical instruments, had just arrived, his walking stick clicking against the path. "This is abominable," he barked. "Thistlewood was a bore, but he didn't deserve this. Lord Peter, I must insist—" "Oh, do insist," Whimsy murmured. "It lends the whole business an air of moral clarity." He stepped back into the sunlight, blinking against its fierce English cheeriness. "Someone ring up the local constabulary, would you, and perhaps put on another pot? I fancy this will require more than one cup of tea." Behind him, the croquet balls lay scattered as if in protest, like punctuation flung across a poorly written sentence. Whimsy stared at them a moment, then bent and picked up the red one. "Curious," he murmured. "It oughtn't to be there, should it?" The guests, huddled in polite disarray, watched him with wary fascination. Miss Phipps, already imagining the poem she would wring from the incident, whispered, "Do you suppose it was a crime of passion?" Whimsy turned the red ball thoughtfully in his hand. "Possibly," he said, "though if so, it was the kind of passion that pays very close attention to the rules of croquet." He smiled. The lawn, after all, was about to get very interesting indeed. The constable arrived in due course, a beefy man named Trimble, whose moustache bristled with officiousness and whose boots announced his presence several steps before he arrived at the scene. He was greeted at the pavilion by a small chorus of distressed gentry, whose collective assumption seemed to be that he might somehow arrest the ghastliness of the affair through sheer local authority. Whimsy, ever courteous, yielded the center of activity to the uniformed man, offering only the most benign of observations. "Unpleasant bit of business," said Trimble, puffing like a man who'd had to walk through too much gravel to get to his mystery. He peered at the body with narrowed eyes and a sort of respectful distaste, like a man confronting an overdone roast. "Slash throat," he pronounced, as if this were not already apparent. "What's he got in his hand?" Whimsy stepped forward, careful not to disturb anything, but evidently unable to help himself. "A cigarette case," he said, peering. "Silver, monogrammed TAT. Our late Mr. Thistlewood, one supposes. Curiously, though, there's no ashtray in sight, nor any scent of tobacco. Perhaps he was interrupted before lighting up." Trimble grunted. "Might have been attacked mid-fag." "Unlikely," murmured Whimsy and pointed. "Look at the positioning. That hand is quite relaxed. No signs of a struggle. No defensive wounds either, unless our killer was wearing velvet gloves." The constable grunted again, a little less surely this time. "Could be someone snuck up behind him." "Quite," said Whimsy, turning to pace the edge of the pavilion. "But consider the peculiar neatness. A man surprised from behind usually makes some effort to protest the interruption of his life. There's not a single overturned chair, no scuff on the rug, no bruise on the hands. One wonders whether he even knew he was being murdered." Sir Everard had hovered behind them like a moth in tweeds, vibrating faintly with inherited authority. At this, he stepped forward. "Now look here, Whimsy. This is my property, and I will not have you making insinuations about the character of my house guests." "I wouldn't dream of it," Whimsy said airily. "I merely observe. It's a most diverting way to spend an afternoon, especially when one's croquet tournament has been so rudely disrupted." Trimble scratched at his temple with the end of his pencil. "I'll need to speak with everyone who was on the lawn when the scream happened." Whimsy gave a gracious wave of the hand. "I've taken the liberty of noting who was present at the time. Shall we proceed to interviews, Inspector, or would you prefer to finish inspecting the corpse?" Trimble looked startled, then grudgingly impressed. "Right. You can help me take statements. I was hoping you'd say that." Whimsy murmured. "Do you suppose we could begin with Miss Boothroyd? She discovered the body and is very likely to faint again if left unaired." Miss Agatha Boothroyd was discovered in the drawing-room, swathed in lace and smelling faintly of lavender salts and Turkish delight. Her eyes were still wide, as if she'd caught sight of something dreadful and then decided to remember it indefinitely. "I was taking a short constitutional," she said, clutching her shawl as though it contained the whole truth. "I often walk along the perimeter of the maze. It's cooler there, meditative. I'd just turned toward the pavilion when I saw him. Lying there, all the blood." She paused and sniffled theatrically. Whimsy perched on the edge of a settee and leaned in, all sympathy and encouragement. "Did you notice anything out of place? A noise? A figure running?" "No, nothing. That's what's so dreadful. It was so peaceful. The birds were chirping, the sun was shining, and there he was, like something from a penny, dreadful." Trimble scribbled furiously. Whimsy, meanwhile, reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook of his own. "Miss Boothroyd, forgive me, but how long had you been walking before you came upon the body?" "Oh, 10 minutes, perhaps 15. I left the group just after Lady Prudence took her second turn, before she made that ridiculous fuss about the ball striking a worm cast." Whimsy smiled. "Ah, yes, a mortal insult to both lawn and game." He made a note. Next came Edward Winstanley, who arrived still clutching a half-full glass and looking as though he'd walked out of a tailor's catalogue for dissolute young men of promise. "I was chatting with Charity near the west hedge," he said. "We were discussing Tennyson and the tragic erosion of public funds for the arts when that scream came. Ghastly sound. I thought someone had taken a spill. Never imagined murder." Trimble leaned forward. "And you saw no one going toward the pavilion?" "No, but I wasn't looking, really. We were by the sundial. You can't see the pavilion clearly from there. Bit of a blind spot with the rose arches." Whimsy looked up. "You'd played a round of croquet earlier, I believe." Edward raised his brows. "Yes, against Thistlewood, funnily enough. He beat me, smug devil. Still, no need to bash his head in for it." "No one suggested anything of the kind," Whimsy said pleasantly. "Though it is interesting. Your red ball was found near the pavilion." Edward frowned. "Red was mine, yes, but I hadn't played it in half an hour." "Indeed. Yet there it lay, all by its lonesome, near the door. Curious, wouldn't you say?" Winstanley shrugged. "Could have been knocked there. Plenty of us were playing." But Whimsy's eyes stayed fixed for a moment longer, as if measuring the precision of the throw. Miss Charity Phipps offered a great deal more than necessary. She described the scream, the way the sunlight dappled the hydrangeas, her last conversation with the deceased. He said rhyming despair with air was cliched. I said he was cliched. And her suspicion that Agatha Boothroyd was in touch with something rather morbid lately. She's been writing automatic poetry. Whimsy received all this with a polite nod and wrote only one thing down. It was as they were finishing with Miss Phipps that Mrs. Denby, the housekeeper, arrived with a puzzled expression. "Beg pardon, my lord, but we've just noticed something strange in the butler's pantry." "Do tell," said Whimsy, instantly alert. "It's the silver salver, sir. It's missing." Trimble blinked. "A tray?" "Yes, sir. The large one. Gilded edge. We used it yesterday at luncheon." Whimsy tapped his notebook. "Now that is interesting. Tell me, would that tray perhaps be large enough to carry a teacup, a saucer, and a rather sharp knife?" Mrs. Denby stared. "I dare say, yes." Whimsy stood. "Then I wonder, has anyone checked the rubbish bins?" Trimble muttered something about priorities, but Whimsy was already striding off toward the servants' wing, his linen suit catching the breeze like a sail, tacking into stormier waters. He paused only once to look again across the croquet lawn. The balls still lay scattered in curious disarray. The red ball, in particular, sat exactly where he'd left it, too close to the pavilion to be an accident, and too far from the last hoop to be anything but a message. Whimsy smiled, just faintly. A game had been played, and someone had tried very hard to win it. But not by the rules. Never by the rules. Whimsy knelt beside the bins behind the kitchen wing, the scent of honeysuckle giving way to something far less poetic as he lifted the heavy lid of the household refuse. A pair of curious kitchen maids lingered nearby, whispering furiously, until Mrs. Denby shooed them away, with a glance sharp enough to skin a trout. The baronet's estate maintained rigid protocols for its domestic order. Murder, apparently, was not an excuse to lapse into gossip near the food. He took his handkerchief from his breast pocket and, using the folded square of linen like a glove, began gingerly lifting items out of the bin. Crumpled napkins, a broken teacup, a slice of fruitcake too heavy for decency. He pushed them aside until the edge of something metallic glinted beneath a stained tablecloth. "Well, well," he murmured. He lifted the cloth to reveal the missing salver. It was large, silver-plated, and scratched along the rim as though it had been hastily shoved against a hard surface. There were faint smudges of something darker than tarnish along one side. Old blood, perhaps, dulled by contact with the damp linen. And nestled within the curve of the salver, tucked almost lovingly into its center, lay a fruit knife. The blade was delicate, of Sheffield make, the sort designed to peel pears at a lady's luncheon. But its edge was still wickedly fine. More tellingly, it bore the unmistakable trace of congealed blood along the lower half of the blade and, more curious still, a small scrap of green fabric clung to the haft. Not a kitchen implement, Whimsy murmured to himself. More likely from one of the guest sets, and someone made an effort to dispose of it, but not too much of an effort. Why hide the murder weapon if you're going to leave the body on display? He stood and handed the tray and knife to Trimble, who had just joined him with an expression of mild exasperation. This wasn't exactly subtle, the constable grumbled. Why not throw it in the pond or burn the lot in the hearth? Perhaps because the killer didn't have the time, Whimsy said, or perhaps he or she wanted to give us the illusion of a hurried act. There's an art to theatrical messes. The wrong kind of neatness always betrays a clever lie. Trimble muttered something about too many clever people by half and trudged back toward the croquet pavilion, the tray tucked under one arm like a boarding school punishment. Whimsy followed at a more leisurely pace, returning to the lawn where the guests now hovered in subdued consternation. Sir Everard was speaking in low, clipped tones to a man in clerical grey, Dr. Fenwick, the village vicar, summoned as both spiritual support and reputable bystander. Lady Prudence had resumed her position in a cane-backed chair with a shawl around her shoulders and an expression of suffering usually reserved for garden parties that served cheap wine. Whimsy's gaze moved past them all and settled on the red croquet ball again. It still sat a little too perfectly in the shadow of the pavilion, as though daring him to place it back into the narrative. He walked over and picked it up again, weighing it in his hand. "Forgive me, Lady Prudence," he said lightly, "but do you happen to recall the last proper round of croquet this ball featured in?" She sniffed. "The last full match was yesterday. Mr. Thistlewood, Miss Phipps, my nephew, and myself. The red was Edward's." Whimsy turned. "And you've not played this morning?" "Only one partial round before tea. But the balls were all in their proper starting positions, of that I'm quite sure. I insist upon order in my matches." "And Edward used the red then as well?" "Yes, and then wandered off after his shot went awry. Whereupon it was last seen heading toward the Rose Arch." She gave a small, annoyed nod. "Indeed, that boy has no control over his swing." Whimsy tapped the red ball with his finger, and yet here it is, nowhere near the Rose Arch. Odd. He returned to Trimble, who was now inspecting the knife beneath the magnifying end of a small torch. "That green fiber," said Whimsy. "It might match Edward's jacket. Tweed, if memory serves. Check the lower sleeve." They found Edward smoking again behind the fountain, trying to look pensive. He gave a wry smile as Whimsy approached. "More questions, I suppose?" "Only one for now," Whimsy said. "Would you kindly show us your jacket?" Edward hesitated, then shrugged it off with the air of a man too tired to care about dignity. Trimble held up the knife and, with surprising delicacy, compared the thread to the coat's weave. "Same color," he muttered. "Looks torn too, frayed just above the cuff." Edward frowned. "What's this about?" "Merely matching fabric," Whimsy said mildly. "Were you anywhere near the pavilion this morning?" "I told you I wasn't." His voice rose slightly. "I played my shot and left the lawn with Charity. I haven't been near the bloody pavilion all day." Trimble gave him a sharp look. "You're sure?" "Positive." "Ask her." "Already did," Whimsy said. "And she was rather more vague about your path than you seem to be." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but shut it again. Whimsy folded his hands behind his back. "Do you know," he said conversationally, "what interests me most is the fruit knife. Not the blade itself, though it's always pleasant to see Sheffield craftsmanship put to work, but the nature of the wound. It was clean, deliberate, not the slash of a panic, but something executed precisely, which suggests the killer was close, calm, and capable. Someone who could strike once and retreat." Edward's face had gone taut. "That's not me, Lord Peter." "No," Whimsy said, "but you're hiding something." There was a beat of silence. Edward swallowed. "All right. Fine. I did go back to the pavilion. Just briefly. After the scream. I saw the red ball near the hedge and thought I'd knocked it farther than I remembered. I went to retrieve it. But by the time I got close, I could see Agatha already rushing out of the maze. I didn't want to get dragged into a scandal, so I ducked behind the archway until she passed. Then I walked back round." Trimble's face was red with frustration. "Why the hell didn't you say that before?" Edward shrugged helplessly. "Because I thought I'd look guilty." Whimsy looked at the young man for a long moment. Then he turned to Trimble. "Interesting. It places him at the scene, but after the murder, assuming he tells the truth. Still, we have only his word." "Which means nothing," Trimble muttered. "Not necessarily," Whimsy said. "It all depends on the sequence. Agatha claims to have discovered the body first, and Edward says he saw her emerge, which means someone was in that pavilion between the two of them." He turned away, his mind racing. There was another piece missing, something to do with the tea tray, the cup still half full, the perfect calm of the corpse. A murder committed with grace, precision, and planning. He looked back, at the Croquet Lawn, then to the guests now dispersing slowly under the weight of dusk and suspicion. It was time to take a closer look at Mr. Thistlewood himself, and more specifically, why anyone would wish him dead. Whimsy stood quietly for a moment, the evening breeze ruffling the edges of his impeccably tailored jacket as he surveyed the Croquet Lawn and the now dispersing company. The late sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass, lending an air of languid finality to the scene. Yet beneath this calm lay a disturbing contradiction. Murder so thoroughly staged as to mock the very tranquility of the estate. His thoughts turned again to the victim, Mr. Thistlewood, a man whose outward composure, polished and refined, concealed an undercurrent of restless ambition. A man whose manner with others had lately become notably less cordial, if whispers were to be trusted. "Sir Everard," Whimsy began, turning to the elderly host who had taken up his customary post near the house steps, "I believe it may be wise to consider Mr. Thistlewood's relationships within this gathering with some care." Sir Everard, his gaze heavy with the weight of responsibility, nodded slowly. "Yes, Lord Peter. I confess he was not universally liked. Some found him difficult." Whimsy's smile was a subtle one. "Difficult men often make enemies, even among friends." "Quite so," Sir Everard replied, his voice low. There was talk yesterday of a dispute with one Mr. Winstanley." "Edward Winstanley," Whimsy murmured. "The young man with the red jacket." Sir Everard confirmed with a nod. "Yes, something about debts owed and a lost opportunity. Edward is a touch reckless and not a man to let grievances rest quietly." Whimsy considered this. The torn cuff, the patch of green fabric on the knife, Edward's nervousness, all suggested a closer involvement than the young man had initially admitted. Yet there remained a puzzling grace to the crime itself, a precision that suggested deliberation rather than rashness. He returned his gaze to the cluster of guests who had gathered by the house, their faces a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled suspicion. Among them, Lady Prudence sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the ground, while Miss Boothroyd lingered near the windows, pale and nervous. "Inspector," Whimsy said, addressing Trimble, "I think we might do well to hear from Lady Prudence again. She appears to have keen eyes and a sharp memory." Trimble grunted in assent, and together they approached the lady. Lady Prudence looked up with an air of fragile dignity. "I suppose I must answer more questions, though I'm quite spent." "Only a few, madam," Whimsy assured her. "You mentioned earlier a particular incident during the croquet game, the matter of the worm cast?" Lady Prudence nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, it was a trifling thing, but Mr. Thistlewood made a rude comment about the lawn-keeper's work. It caused quite a stir. I recall that he seemed unusually irritable afterwards." "A trifling matter, perhaps," Whimsy said thoughtfully, "but even small insults can kindle great fires, especially among those sensitive to slights." She sighed. "Indeed. And Edward, as you know, is fond of gardening." He was quite offended by the remark. "Did Mr. Thistlewood have other adversaries?" "Several," she admitted. "Miss Phipps, for one, has often sparred with him over poetry and artistic tastes. He was dismissive of many people's opinions, and that made him few friends." Whimsy nodded. "Art and turf disputes aside, did you notice anything unusual on the day of the murder? Any visitor acting oddly? Any sounds out of place?" Lady Prudence hesitated. "Now that you mention it, I did hear a faint whisper near the rose arch just before the scream. But it was so quiet, I could not be certain if it was real or my imagination." "Whispers can be important," Whimsy said with a small smile. "And where were you at that moment?" "By the sundial, preparing for my next turn." Trimble took out his notebook. "Did you recognize the voice?" "No, it was too low, possibly two people speaking in hushed tones." Whimsy's interest was piqued. A whispered conversation near the rose arch before the scream suggested someone had been there, unseen by others. He turned to Miss Boothroyd, who had remained silent nearby. "Miss Boothroyd, you said you walked along the maze perimeter before discovering the body. Did you hear anything? Voices, footsteps, while you were walking?" She bit her lip. "No, only the usual rustling of the leaves. But I felt a chill. Something was wrong, though I could not say what." Whimsy stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The chill of danger, perhaps. Or the chill of knowledge." The girl nodded slightly, eyes wide. "Very well," Whimsy said aloud. "I propose we examine the rose arch and the path nearby." They moved together toward the spot where Edward had claimed to retrieve the red bowl and where Lady Prudence had heard whispers. The rose arch was heavy with blossoms, their scent delicate but pervasive. The gravel beneath was freshly raked, save for a few small footprints too faint for immediate identification. Whimsy bent down to inspect the ground, brushing aside fallen petals. There, barely visible, were impressions of a shoe sole, likely a man's, leading away toward the pavilion. "Someone passed here recently," he noted, "and in a hurry." Trimble crouched beside him. "Could be our killer's trail." "Possibly. And notice how the prints end abruptly at the pavilion steps. No return trail." Whimsy looked up at the pavilion. "The killer must have exited another way. There is a service door on the opposite side, yes?" "Indeed," Sir Everard replied. "But it is usually locked and barred during the afternoon. Security is often an illusion, Whimsy said softly. He glanced back at the guests gathering nearby and saw Edward approaching, face pale but resolute. I hear you've been examining the rose arch, Edward said. Indeed, Whimsy replied. And it appears someone was moving near there shortly before the crime. Edward's lip trembled. Look, I want to help. I don't know who did this, but I want it to stop. Your cooperation will be vital, Whimsy said kindly. Tell me, did you notice anyone near the pavilion before the scream? Edward shook his head. No one. Only Charity and me, on the far side near the fountain. Charity, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. Just then, Miss Phipps stepped forward, her manner brusque. I'd like to add something, she said. I was near the fountain, yes, but I thought I saw someone leave the pavilion about 5 minutes before the scream. A tall figure, moving quickly, but it was too shadowy to be certain. Did you recognize them? Whimsy asked. No, too distant, but they wore a dark coat. Whimsy glanced at the gathering dusk. A dark coat. Very well, that's useful. He turned to Trimble. We have several threads here. The victim's recent disputes, the whispered conversation near the rose arch, the mysterious figure leaving the pavilion just before the murder, and the discarded knife with traces of blood and fabric matching Edward's jacket. Trimble frowned. A lot of coincidence, if you ask me. Or a tangled web waiting to be unraveled, Whimsy said quietly. He studied the guests' faces as they stood silently in the cooling evening air. Suspicion mingled with fear and uncertainty, creating an atmosphere as tense as the calm before a summer storm. Inspector, Whimsy said, I think it's time we called in a few more questions, and perhaps requested that no one leave until we have a clearer picture. Trimble gave a reluctant nod. Sir Everard stepped forward. My guests will comply, of course. I want the truth as much as anyone. Whimsy smiled faintly. Good. Because the truth has a way of making itself known even when we least expect it. As the group settled down for what promised to be a long evening, Whimsy's mind was already turning over the possibilities, weighing the fragments of evidence like precious stones. Somewhere amid the polished facades and whispered resentments lay the answer, and Lord Peter Whimsy was determined to find it. The evening deepened, folding the estate in shadows that stretched long and soft beneath the garden trees. A faint breeze stirred the scent of roses and damp earth as Lord Peter Whimsy paced slowly alongside the Croquet Lawn, his mind piecing together the fragments gathered so far. The guests, no longer the lively company of earlier hours, had settled into uneasy silence. The tension in the air was as palpable as the chill creeping beneath the fading warmth of the day. Inspector Trimble stood nearby, arms folded, watching with the wary patience born of years spent wrestling half-truths and guarded confessions. It's a tricky one, my lord, he muttered, voice low so as not to disturb the stillness. The kind of case that turns on a glance, a slip of the tongue, or something too small to notice at first. Whimsy nodded, his gaze lingering on the spot beneath the rose arch where the faint shoe prints had been found. Indeed, and yet those small things often hide the sharpest edges. He paused, hands behind his back, and considered the scene again, the body arranged with such deliberate care, the salver discarded as if to taunt, the knife wiped almost clean but for that stubborn smear of dark red and the scrap of green fabric. There was something theatrical in the killer's choice, a message buried beneath the apparent chaos. Whimsy's thoughts returned to Edward Winstanley. The torn sleeve on the tweed jacket, the piece of fabric caught on the blade. It was a glaring detail, yet Edward's account had been hesitant, even evasive. The young man claimed to have merely retrieved a wayward ball, but the timing was curious. Between Edward's arrival near the pavilion and Miss Boothroyd's discovery of the body, there was a window during which the murder had been committed. Inspector, Whimsy said suddenly, turning toward Trimble, we must be sure of the timeline. When exactly did Miss Boothroyd find the body? Trimble consulted his notes. She said shortly after the scream, around 4:30. And Edward says he was near the Rose Arch just before that, retrieving the red ball. Yes, the inspector agreed, but the scream means the murder was discovered, not necessarily when it was committed. Precisely, Whimsy said. So the fatal act could have happened moments before, or possibly several minutes earlier, giving time for the killer to slip away. He looked across at Miss Boothroyd, who was standing somewhat apart from the others, her eyes wide and uncertain. Miss Boothroyd, might you tell me again what you observed on that afternoon? Any sounds or movements that seemed out of place? She swallowed nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. I was walking along the edge of the maze, as I said. It was quiet. Too quiet, in fact. I thought I heard voices, but I wasn't sure. Then I heard the scream and ran toward the pavilion. Did the voices sound like an argument, or something else? More like hushed tones, urgent but careful, almost as if someone was warning or persuading. Interesting, Whimsy murmured. You mentioned the maze. Did you happen to see anyone enter or leave through its gates around that time? No, I don't believe so. The gate near the Rose Arch was closed, but I didn't check the other entrances. Thank you, Miss Boothroyd. That will be helpful. Whimsy then turned to the assembled guests, now quiet as a gathering of wary spectators. I would ask that everyone remain close, please. No one should leave the grounds until we have spoken further. Sir Everard stepped forward, face lined with fatigue but determined. Of course, Lord Peter. We all want this matter resolved. Whimsy nodded in appreciation and turned to Inspector Trimble. We must examine the service door to the pavilion. If the prints lead there, but none return, perhaps the killer used that exit. The inspector grunted, then led the way across the lawn. The pavilion itself was a charming structure of white-painted wood and latticed windows, its delicate architecture contrasting starkly with the violence committed within. The main entrance faced the lawn, but at the rear was a smaller service door, currently closed but not locked. Whimsy gestured to Trimble. Open it, please. The door creaked on its hinges, revealing a narrow path through the undergrowth, barely visible in the failing light. Whimsy's keen eyes caught a faint disturbance in the soil near the threshold. Scattered leaves pressed flat, as if someone had passed in haste. He knelt and studied the ground closely. Fresh disturbance. The killer fled this way, likely to avoid being seen. Trimble scanned the perimeter with a lantern, then spoke again. There's a gate over here, leading to the kitchen garden. Locked, but the latch looks recently tampered with. Whimsy rose thoughtfully. A quick escape route then. Someone familiar with the estate. That knowledge narrowed the circle of suspects considerably. Returning to the house, Whimsy called Sir Everard aside. Has anyone in your service staff been absent or acting strangely today? The baronet hesitated, a shadow passing over his features. Our new gardener, Mr. Collins, was found missing shortly after tea. He had been rather surly lately, but I didn't imagine it would come to this. Surly, yes, but dangerous. Sir Everard shook his head. I cannot say. He was new and kept mostly to himself. Whimsy's mind turned over the possibilities. If he fled through the garden gate, he may have left tracks or other evidence behind. He resolved to have the grounds searched thoroughly as soon as daylight returned. As night deepened, the guests were gathered in the drawing-room, where the air hung thick with unease. Lady Prudence sat stiffly on a settee, clutching her shawl, while Miss Phipps paced in restless bursts, eyes sharp and darting. Edward Winstanley sat apart, hands clasped tightly, his face pale but composed. Whimsy approached him gently. Mr. Winstanley, I hope you understand that suspicion falls heavily upon those near the scene. Your torn sleeve and the fabric on the knife cannot be ignored. Edward met his gaze steadily. I understand, my lord. But I swear I did not kill him. Whimsy gave a small nod. Very well. Then perhaps you can tell me why you were so reluctant to mention your return to the pavilion." Edward hesitated, then sighed. "I feared it would make me look guilty, even though I had no part in the murder. The place felt wrong, like a trap. I wanted to keep away from it." "Fear can cloud judgment," Whimsy said. "But honesty will serve you better now." Edward's eyes flickered toward the window, then back. "There's something else. I saw Charity near the pavilion around the time the body was found." Whimsy's interest sharpened. "Charity? Miss Boothroyd?" "Yes." She seemed upset, like she'd seen something she shouldn't. Whimsy exchanged a look with Inspector Trimble. "We will speak with her again." The door opened, and Miss Boothroyd entered quietly, cheeks flushed from the chill air outside. "Miss Boothroyd," Whimsy said kindly, "would you mind telling me again about your movements and what you saw near the pavilion?" She swallowed, voice trembling slightly. I was walking by the maze when I heard voices. Then the scream. I ran toward the pavilion and saw the body, but before that I thought I caught a glimpse of someone leaving in a dark coat. I couldn't see their face." "Did you notice anything unusual about their gait, their height or build?" She nodded slowly. "Tall, broad shoulders. They moved quickly, like they were in a hurry." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "Did anyone wear such a coat here today?" There was a pause as the room seemed to hold its breath. Edward Winstanley shook his head. "I don't own such a coat." Miss Phipps spoke up. "Nor I." Lady Prudence frowned. "Nor I." Sir Everard added quietly, "I might have seen the butler wearing a dark coat earlier." "Ah," Whimsy said softly. "Mr. Faraday, the butler." The mention caused a ripple of surprise. The butler was a figure known for his impeccable service and quiet reserve. "Inspector," Whimsy said, "we must speak with Mr. Faraday at once." Trimble nodded and left to summon the butler. As they waited, Whimsy returned to the window, watching shadows deepen around the estate. The killer had been careful, but not careful enough. They had left a trail of evidence: fabric, footprints, uncertain alibis. The pieces were beginning to align. When Mr. Faraday entered, his posture was straight, but his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "Mr. Faraday," Whimsy began, "I understand you wore a dark coat this afternoon." The butler inclined his head. "Yes, my lord. It was a chill day." "Were you near the pavilion around the time of the murder?" "I was preparing tea service nearby, but I did not leave the kitchen wing." "Can anyone vouch for your whereabouts?" The butler's gaze flickered. "The kitchen staff was busy preparing the meal. I was alone briefly." Whimsy studied him thoughtfully. "Might I see the coat?" Faraday hesitated, then removed the coat with deliberate care. Whimsy inspected it closely. The hem was clean, no sign of disturbance or fabric torn. Yet the figure seen, leaving the pavilion, wore a coat with torn sleeves, Whimsy observed. Faraday's expression tightened. "I'm certain I did not leave the kitchen wing." Whimsy nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Faraday. For now, you are free to remain with the company, but do not leave the grounds." As Faraday withdrew, Whimsy turned to Inspector Trimble. "We have a witness who saw someone leaving in a dark coat. We have Edward's fabric and torn sleeve. Someone fled through the garden gate, and there is a missing gardener." Trimble sighed. "It's a web all right, but which thread do we pull first?" Whimsy's eyes gleamed with resolve. "The gardener, I think. If he fled the scene, he may hold the key." He looked once more toward the darkening sky. Tomorrow, the search will begin in earnest. For now, the estate lay shrouded in quiet suspicion, but tomorrow, the truth would come closer, and Lord Peter Whimsy would be ready. The early morning mist curled softly around the hedgerows as the search party moved through the grounds of Compton Abbey. Lord Peter Whimsy walked alongside Inspector Trimble and a small group of estate workers, his keen eyes sweeping the landscape for anything out of place. The gardeners had resumed their labors, but the mood was somber and every glance was wary. every shadow suspicious. The disappearance of Mr. Collins, the new gardener, had shifted the investigation into a new phase. His absence was a glaring puzzle piece. If he had fled the estate at the moment of the murder, was it out of guilt or fear? Whimsy found the question gnawing at the edge of his thoughts. The group had just crossed the vegetable garden when one of the men called out, "Here, sir, tracks leading to the back fence." Whimsy and Trimble hurried over. In the soft earth were clear boot impressions, large and uneven, as if the wearer had been running or fleeing in haste. Whimsy crouched, examining the prints with practiced care. "These prints lead to the service gate, just as we suspected." He pointed to a slight indentation where the gate's latch had been forced open. "Someone left in a hurry, no doubt." Trimble nodded grimly. "It fits with the missing gardener theory." Whimsy rose and looked around. The morning sun was beginning to burn through the mist, revealing the sprawling grounds in sharp relief. "We must find Collins before he causes more trouble, or worse." The search resumed with renewed energy, parties spreading out in small groups to cover the expansive gardens, the maze, and the less frequented woodland paths beyond the estate boundary. Back at the house, Lady Prudence paced anxiously in the drawing-room, her usual composure fractured by the events of the day. The servants moved silently, the clatter of china replaced by a tense hush. It was a household on edge, held captive by fear and suspicion. Whimsy returned after a brief reconnaissance, his expression grave but determined. He gathered the key figures. In the study, a small, book-lined room warmed by a flickering fire. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "our search for Mr. Collins continues. His disappearance is significant. The evidence suggests he left in haste shortly after the murder. That alone raises serious questions." Sir Everard shifted uncomfortably. "What reason would he have to flee if he had no involvement?" "That is precisely what we must determine," Whimsy replied. "But I am inclined to believe that the gardener's departure is not coincidental." He turned to Inspector Trimble. "What of the alibis this morning? Has anyone noticed anything unusual among the staff or guests?" Trimble rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Nothing concrete yet, but some reports suggest that Mr. Faraday, the butler, was less visible than usual during the afternoon. There are gaps in his movements that merit further inquiry." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Indeed. And the torn fabric found on the murder weapon remains a puzzle. The sleeve on Mr. Winstanley's jacket is a match, but Edward's reluctance to speak freely about his movements raises concerns." Edward sat quietly, fingers steepled, as if weighing the consequences of each word. "Mr. Winstanley," Whimsy said gently, "your cooperation is vital. You told me earlier that you saw Miss Boothroyd near the pavilion around the time the body was discovered. Have you spoken with her since?" Edward shook his head. "No. I wanted to avoid causing alarm. I'm afraid my involvement seems suspicious, but I assure you I have no part in this crime." "Very well," Whimsy said. "Then perhaps you can help me understand more about your encounter. Did you notice anything unusual about Miss Boothroyd's behavior?" Edward hesitated. "She seemed anxious, distracted. When she saw me, she quickly looked away as if trying to hide something." Whimsy murmured. "Miss Boothroyd has told me she heard voices, urgent whispers before the scream, but she did not see the speaker's face. We also have her account of seeing a tall figure in a dark coat leaving the pavilion." Sir Everard frowned. "You believe that figure might be the killer?" "Or an accomplice," Whimsy answered. "We cannot yet say, but the detail about the dark coat directs suspicion toward those who wear such attire here." Lady Prudence's eyes flashed. "You mentioned the butler wears a dark coat." "Yes," Whimsy said. "Mr. Faraday was present this afternoon, but there are gaps in his whereabouts." Trimble pulled out a small notebook. "I've arranged to question the kitchen staff about Mr. Faraday's movements." Before the inspector could continue, a sharp knock sounded at the door. A young maid entered, face pale but steady. "Sir, we have found Mr. Collins." All eyes turned as the maid handed a folded note to Whimsy. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was hurried and jagged. "I am innocent, but must leave to clear my name. Do not trust those who watch you closely." Whimsy's lips tightened. A cryptic message, but it confirms his flight was purposeful. Sir Everard scowled. Why would he imply he's being watched? Whimsy folded the note and looked out the window. The estate, so tranquil in the light of day, seemed suddenly sinister, a stage set for secrets and betrayal. "Inspector, we must locate Mr. Collins immediately. He may be our key to understanding the full story." Trimble nodded. "I'll coordinate with the local constables. He won't get far." Whimsy turned to Edward. "Mr. Winstanley, I must ask you again. Did you notice anything unusual in the garden this morning? Anyone out of place?" Edward's gaze flickered nervously. "Now that you mention it, I thought I saw Mr. Faraday near the rose arch. Not where he should have been." The room stirred with surprise. "Near the rose arch?" Whimsy asked. "That area was close to the scene of the murder." Edward nodded. "Yes, but I did not want to cause suspicion." Whimsy's mind raced. If Faraday had been near the rose arch and the figure seen leaving wore a dark coat matching his, the pieces might be falling into place. "Inspector," Whimsy said, "we need to speak to Mr. Faraday again, with this new information." Trimble agreed and left promptly to fetch the butler. While waiting, Whimsy's thoughts returned to the torn fabric and the bloodied knife. He realized the killer must have engaged in a struggle. The torn sleeve suggested the victim or attacker had grabbed at the coat, trying to stop a swift escape. The butler returned, his expression calm but guarded. "Mr. Faraday," Whimsy began, "we have received a new report placing you near the rose arch around the time of the murder." Faraday's jaw tightened, but he answered evenly. "I cannot deny I passed that way. I was attending to a matter of estate security." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Estate security?" "Yes, my lord. There have been concerns about trespassers and petty thefts recently. I was investigating reports of a suspicious figure near the grounds." "Why did you not mention this earlier?" Faraday looked away briefly. "I feared it would raise doubts about me." "Understandable, but in a case such as this, transparency is essential." Whimsy studied the man carefully. "Did you see anyone suspicious during your rounds?" "No one, only shadows and the echo of footsteps." The inspector interjected. "Mr. Faraday, can you account for your whereabouts during the hour in question?" The butler hesitated, then replied, "I was in and out of the kitchen wing, checking on preparations for tonight's dinner. Alone for a few minutes, yes, but never far." Whimsy nodded slowly. "Thank you. That will be all for now." As Faraday left, the tension in the room was palpable. "Inspector," Whimsy said quietly, "the butler's story is plausible, but unverified. We need to verify his movements with the kitchen staff." Trimble agreed. "I'll start questioning immediately." The morning wore on with the slow, deliberate pace of a puzzle being turned over, piece by piece. New details emerged: a torn button found near the garden path, a scrap of fabric matching the gardener's clothes, footprints that led both toward and away from the estate. Whimsy convened a brief meeting with the key staff in the drawing room. "We now know Mr. Collins fled the scene, leaving behind traces that may be crucial. The torn button matches his uniform." Miss Boothroyd spoke softly. "If Collins fled, could he be innocent but scared?" Whimsy considered. "It is possible. Fear can cause rash decisions. But his flight suggests knowledge or guilt." Sir Everard looked troubled. "What of the others? Could the killer be among us still?" Whimsy's eyes swept the room. "We must remain vigilant. The murderer is clever and familiar with this estate. They used the service gate to escape undetected and counted on confusion to cover their tracks." Edward broke the silence. "If I may, Lord Peter, I wish to cooperate fully. There is more I have not said." Whimsy inclined his head. "Please, Mr. Winstanley." Edward took a breath. I saw Charity speaking with Mr. Collins earlier that day. They argued quietly near the tool shed. She seemed distressed. Distressed how? Whimsy pressed. Angry and fearful. She accused him of something, of lying or stealing, perhaps. Whimsy's mind flicked back to the note Collins left, warning of watchers and distrust. If Charity and Collins were involved in some secret dispute, it could be the motive behind the murder. Miss Boothroyd, Whimsy asked gently, can you confirm this? Charity nodded slowly. It is true. We had words that afternoon, but I swear I had nothing to do with the murder. Whimsy gave her a reassuring glance. We will find the truth. Your honesty is appreciated. As the day wore on, the threads of the mystery tightened. A storm was gathering, not only in the darkening sky overhead, but in the tangled web of relationships, secrets, and lies that surrounded Compton Abbey. Whimsy knew that soon the killer would slip or speak, and when they did, justice would be swift. Until then, the shadows deepened, and the estate held its breath. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Compton Abbey's drawing room, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and flicker like restless spirits. Lord Peter Whimsy sat quietly, his fingers loosely clasped, eyes distant but alert. The events of the day pressed heavily upon the household, each revelation unraveling into a tangle of suspicions and half-truths. Inspector Trimble was just returning from the kitchens, his brow furrowed with concern. Lord Peter, he began, the kitchen staff confirmed that Mr. Faraday was indeed in the kitchen during the earliest afternoon, but there were moments when no one saw him clearly. Several cooks mentioned he slipped away briefly around the time the scream was heard. Whimsy nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. So, Mr. Faraday's alibi is weaker than he admits, and we know from Miss Boothroyd that a tall figure in a dark coat was seen leaving the pavilion shortly after the scream. Indeed, the inspector agreed. There is also the matter of the torn fabric on the murder weapon, which matches Mr. Winstanley's sleeve, but he claims no memory of how it was torn. Whimsy leaned forward, his eyes sharp. We must explore that contradiction carefully. Edward Winstanley's reluctance to explain is troubling. We also have the note from Collins, claiming innocence but hinting at someone watching him. A faint knock at the door interrupted them. It was Charity Boothroyd, looking more composed but with a wary expression. Lord Peter, I have something to say, she began hesitantly. Whimsy gestured for her to continue. I spoke with Mr. Collins before he disappeared, Charity said. He was scared. He told me that someone had been pressuring him about something about the estate's accounts or the tools. He was frightened they might blame him for something he didn't do. Whimsy's mind raced. You believe someone was trying to frame him? Possibly, Charity replied. He begged me not to tell anyone because he feared for his safety. Thank you, Charity. Your honesty is vital, Whimsy said with a reassuring nod. As Charity left, Whimsy and Trimble exchanged looks of understanding. The gardener's disappearance, the note, the threats. It all suggested a hidden conflict beneath the estate's calm surface. Inspector, Whimsy said, we need to interview the remaining staff thoroughly, especially those with access to the tools and accounts. There may be a motive buried there. Trimble agreed and began making plans to question the kitchen and grounds staff more closely. Later, as the household settled into an uneasy silence, Whimsy found himself drawn toward the gardens. The air was cooler now, the golden hues of the setting sun giving way to the dimming light of early evening. He walked slowly toward the Rose Arch, the place Edward Winstanley had said he saw Faraday. The garden was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird returning to roost. Whimsy crouched beside the arch and inspected the ground carefully. There were faint impressions of footsteps, some small and light, others heavier and muddled, as if a struggle had taken place. He rose and looked up toward the pavilion. Its windows glinted faintly in the dying light. The scene of the crime remained hauntingly still. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye, a figure slipping quietly from the shadow of a yew tree. Whimsy's pulse quickened. He stepped forward and called softly, "Excuse me, sir, may I have a word?" The man stopped and turned slowly. It was one of the estate's stable hands, a wiry, nervous young man named George Mills. "Yes, Lord Peter?" George asked, his voice low. "Have you noticed anything unusual today? Anyone acting strangely, or perhaps any suspicious noises?" George swallowed and glanced around. "I don't like to gossip, but I did see Mr. Faraday arguing quietly with someone near the stables earlier today. It was just after noon. They looked angry, almost threatening." "Did you hear what they said?" "No, sir. It was too quiet and I was across the yard. But Mr. Faraday seemed agitated, more than usual." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, George. That is very helpful." As George hurried away, Whimsy's thoughts turned to the implications. Faraday's presence near the rose arch, his brief disappearance from the kitchen, the argument near the stables. It was all adding up to something significant. He walked back toward the house, where the inspector was waiting with news. "Lord Peter," Trimble said gravely, "we've uncovered something curious. The torn button found near the garden path doesn't belong to Collins after all. It matches a uniform jacket kept in the servants' quarters, one worn by Mr. Faraday himself." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "How intriguing. And what do the servants say about that?" "Several noticed that Mr. Faraday's coat was torn this afternoon, but he claimed it happened while moving furniture in the main hall." "That story does not sit well with me," Whimsy said. "A torn sleeve matching the fabric on the murder weapon, and a coat with a ripped button found near the scene. It points to Mr. Faraday being involved in the struggle." The inspector nodded. "I've arranged for him to be questioned again this evening." Whimsy allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, but knew the danger was far from over. Later, in the dimly lit study, Faraday sat across from Whimsy and Trimble, his face pale but defiant. "Mr. Faraday," Whimsy began gently, "the evidence places you near the rose arch, around the time of the murder. We also have this torn button matching your coat found at the scene." Faraday's jaw tightened. "I admit I was near the rose arch, but I had no involvement in the murder." "Then explain the torn sleeve on the knife, matching your coat's fabric, and your disappearing moments during the kitchen alibi," Whimsy pressed. Faraday's eyes darted. "I was confronted by Collins. He was angry, accusing me of stealing from the estate. We fought briefly. I tore my coat trying to stop him from running off." "Why did you not mention this before?" "I feared it would make me a suspect, but I swear I did not kill him." "Where is Mr. Collins now?" Faraday looked away. "I do not know. After our fight, he fled through the back gate. I could not follow." Whimsy and Trimble exchanged a glance. The gardener's flight made sense now, but the murder remained unsolved. "We will investigate this further," Whimsy said calmly. "For now, I advise you to remain here." As Faraday left the room, Whimsy turned to the inspector. "Inspector, we must locate Collins immediately. He may hold the key to all this." Trimble nodded. "I've sent out search parties. We should hear news soon." The evening deepened, and with it the shadows grew longer. As Whimsy settled in to review the evidence once more, a sudden knock startled him. It was Charity Boothroyd, her face pale and urgent. "Lord Peter," she whispered, "I overheard something just now. A whispered conversation in the servants' hall. Someone speaking of the missing papers and making it look like Collins did it." Whimsy's pulse quickened. "What papers?" "I don't know, but it sounded serious." He nodded firmly. "Thank you, Charity. That may be the breakthrough we need." As the household held its breath through the night, the mystery of Compton Abbey deepened, woven tightly with lies, fear, and desperate attempts to hide a truth more dangerous than anyone had yet imagined. The search for Collins continued, but Lord Peter Whimsy knew the killer was still close. watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The night had deepened its hold on Compton Abbey, the moon a pale sliver behind a veil of drifting clouds. The house lay still, every creak and whisper amplified in the heavy silence that pressed on its ancient walls. Inside the dimly lit study, Lord Peter Wimsey sat by the flickering fire, papers and notes spread before him like scattered footprints in a dark forest. The threads of the mystery tangled tighter with every passing hour, and the weight of unspoken truths seemed to thicken the air itself. A soft knock came at the door, barely more than a hesitation. Wimsey looked up to see Charity Boothroyd enter quietly, her eyes wide with the urgency she had struggled to contain earlier. "Lord Peter, there's something else," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if the shadows might be listening. "I couldn't sleep, so I wandered down the corridor near the servants' quarters. I thought I heard voices. 2 men talking, low and hurried. They mentioned the missing papers and how they needed to make it look like Collins did it." Wimsey's keen gaze locked onto hers. "Did you catch any names, or anything else that might help us?" Charity shook her head slowly. No names, but one voice was rough, angry. The other sounded more cautious. They spoke of covering tracks and getting rid of loose ends. It all sounded very deliberate. The room seemed to contract around them, the flickering firelight suddenly inadequate against the creeping tension. "Thank you, Charity. Your bravery in sharing this is appreciated." Wimsey stood and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain, just enough to peer into the moonlit gardens. This missing papers business, it may be the key to understanding what Collins was fleeing from and who would want to implicate him falsely. Inspector Trimble entered, a serious expression creasing his weathered face. "Lord Peter, search parties have returned. No sign of Mr. Collins yet, but the woods to the east were scoured thoroughly." Wimsey nodded. "Time is against us. If Collins is innocent and in danger, every moment lost could mean disaster." Trimble's gaze sharpened. "There's more. The kitchen staff have confirmed Mr. Faraday's brief disappearances. Some recalled seeing him near the servants' quarters just before the voices Charity overheard." Wimsey's brow furrowed deeply. "It fits an increasingly sinister pattern. Faraday's involvement cannot be accidental." The inspector leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's talk among the servants, whispers of a hidden ledger, documents that could expose irregularities in estate funds or tool inventories. Some suspect Faraday has been covering his tracks." Wimsey folded his hands. The torn button and the torn sleeve on the weapon connect to him, and now these missing papers potentially tie him to embezzlement or theft, which could give him motive. Not just for theft, but for silencing Collins, who may have discovered too much. Wimsey paced thoughtfully. "We must confront Faraday again, but carefully. His temper is known to be volatile, and if he suspects we are closing in, he might flee or worse." Trimble agreed. "I'll arrange for a quiet questioning before dawn. Meanwhile, it might be wise to keep the household together tonight." Wimsey nodded, then paused. "There is something else I must do." He stepped away and crossed the room, retrieving from a drawer a small leather-bound notebook. Opening it, he read through the notes Collins had jotted before his disappearance. Scraps of shorthand, cryptic phrases, and repeated mentions of discrepancies and threats. "One line catches my eye," Wimsey murmured. "If I vanish, look to the shadows where trust is false." Collins suspected danger close at hand, Trimble said grimly. He must have confided little, but enough to terrify him. "Indeed," Wimsey agreed, "we are dealing with a man cornered, desperate, and rightly afraid." That night, as the household settled under uneasy watch, Wimsey sat by his window once more, the gardens bathed in silver light. The familiar scent of roses mingled with the faint aroma of damp earth, and somewhere a nightbird called softly. Yet beneath the beauty, a threat lingered, hidden and patient. Suddenly, A shadow detached itself from the darkness near the servants' entrance. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. He stepped outside quietly, moving through the cool night air toward the figure. As he drew closer, recognition dawned. It was Edward Winstanley. "Edward, what brings you out at this hour?" Whimsy's voice was gentle but firm. The young man started, clearly unsettled. "Lord Peter, I could not sleep. I keep turning over everything in my mind." "Understandable. The tension is nearly unbearable." Edward ran a hand through his hair. "I must confess something. I was not entirely truthful about the torn sleeve on my jacket. It tore during a confrontation, yes, but not in the way I described." Whimsy's interest piqued. "Go on." Edward swallowed hard. "I saw Mr. Faraday arguing with Collins near the tool shed earlier that day. Collins threatened to expose Faraday's irregularities unless he confessed. Faraday flew into a rage, grabbing Collins' arm. In the struggle, my sleeve caught on a nail." "So you were nearby during the altercation?" "Yes, but I feared speaking up would only deepen suspicion on me." Whimsy studied Edward. "Your hesitation is noted, but honesty now could be crucial. You did not witness the murder itself?" "No. After the fight, I left quickly, fearing trouble." Whimsy placed a reassuring hand on Edward's shoulder. "Thank you for your courage. This helps clarify the sequence of events." The young man nodded, looking relieved but weary. "I only want the truth to come out." As Edward returned to the house, Whimsy remained outside a moment longer, contemplating the implications. The confrontation between Faraday and Collins was clearly central, but it did not yet explain the murder itself. Back inside, Whimsy met with Trimble and shared Edward's confession. "Faraday's motives deepen," the inspector said grimly. "We need a plan to draw him out." Whimsy nodded slowly. "We will set a trap. Something to unsettle him, make him reveal his hand." They decided on a ruse, a staged discovery of the missing papers. If Faraday believed the documents had been found, he might attempt to retrieve or destroy them. The next morning, a careful search uncovered a bundle of papers hidden in a disused cupboard near the servants' hall. The news spread quickly, and Faraday's face betrayed a flicker of panic when told. That afternoon, Whimsy and Trimble watched quietly from a distance as Faraday made an unexpected visit to the garden, lingering near the rose arch and the pavilion. As the butler reached toward the bushes, a sudden shout startled the observers. Faraday spun, clutching a small bundle, papers, pressed tightly to his chest. "Mr. Faraday," Whimsy called, stepping forward with Trimble. The butler's shoulders tensed. "You have no right." "Put the papers down and answer questions," Whimsy ordered calmly. Faraday hesitated, then slowly released the bundle. His face was pale, sweat beading at his temples. Inside, Whimsy examined the papers carefully. They detailed missing inventory, suspicious transactions, and clear evidence of embezzlement. "The motive is laid bare," Whimsy said, quietly. "And Collins' fear was justified." Faraday's gaze darkened. "I was desperate. Collins threatened to ruin me." "Did you kill him?" Whimsy asked directly. Faraday's voice dropped. "No, but I did confront him. I admit it got out of hand." "Where were you when Collins died?" The butler's eyes flickered away. "I was returning to the house when I heard a scream. I found Collins, collapsed near the pavilion." Whimsy's thoughts raced. Faraday's involvement was undeniable, but was he the murderer or merely an accomplice in a more complicated scheme? The investigation deepened with renewed urgency. As the household gathered once more, eyes wary and voices low, Whimsy prepared to uncover the final layers of deception that bound the fate of Compton Abbey. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying secrets old and new, while beneath the estate's ancient stones, the truth waited, patient and inexorable. The weight of the day pressed heavily on Compton Abbey. As if the very walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the next turn in the unfolding drama. Lord Peter Wimsey sat by the fire in the great drawing-room, the faint glow flickering over his contemplative face. The papers Faraday had been caught trying to retrieve lay neatly arranged on the low table before him, each sheet a testament to the web of deceit that had festered beneath the estate's calm surface. But even with this discovery, the question of who had actually dealt the fatal blow to Collins remained unanswered. Inspector Trimble sat opposite, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Faraday's confession narrows the field, but his story still doesn't account for the precise moment of the murder. If he found Collins collapsed near the pavilion, someone else might have been involved, or the fatal injury could have been inflicted earlier. Wimsey nodded, his fingers steepled. Precisely. Faraday's desperation gives him motive for confrontation, but not necessarily for murder. The timing of events is critical now. We must establish a clear timeline between the argument at the toolshed and Collins' death. Their discussion was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Charity Boothroyd entered, her expression grave but determined. "Lord Peter, Inspector, there's something you should know. While I was helping in the servants' hall this morning, I overheard a conversation between two of the housemaids. They spoke in hushed tones about seeing a stranger on the grounds late yesterday afternoon, someone none of them recognized." Wimsey's interest was piqued. "A stranger, you say? Did they describe the man?" Charity nodded. "They said he wore a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low, and that he lingered near the west wing, close to where the missing papers were supposedly kept." Trimble exchanged a glance with Wimsey. This fits the pattern of someone trying to conceal their presence. Could this be the person who tried to silence Collins? Wimsey rose and began pacing slowly, his mind assembling the puzzle pieces. The presence of an unknown figure suggests there may be more players involved than we suspected. Faraday's attempts to cover his theft might be part of a larger scheme. Charity bit her lip anxiously. But if there's a stranger lurking about, how could we have missed him? Such visitors often use the cover of darkness or moments when the staff's attention is elsewhere, Wimsey replied. We must broaden our search and question everyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual. Trimble made a note. I will send men to canvass the neighboring cottages and question the groundskeepers. Someone might have noticed something out of place. As Charity left to assist the household, Wimsey turned his attention back to the papers. These ledgers show a clear trail of missing funds and unauthorized sales. Faraday is deeply implicated in the estate's financial irregularities. Collins may have discovered the extent and threatened to expose him, which would explain the confrontation, Trimble said, but still not the murder. True. Let us consider Faraday's movements more closely. He claims to have been near the Rose Arch when he heard the scream. Yet his torn coat sleeve was found to match the fabric on the murder weapon, and the torn button found near the garden matched his coat. This strongly suggests a physical struggle occurred. Wimsey tapped the papers. It is likely Faraday confronted Collins. A fight broke out, and in the chaos, Collins sustained injuries. But if Faraday fled the scene, who delivered the fatal blow? Perhaps the stranger, Trimble suggested, or someone else with a vested interest in silencing Collins. Wimsey's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. We must revisit the testimonies of the staff. Edward Winstanley admitted to seeing Faraday and Collins argue, but claims to have left before the altercation escalated. Charity's report of voices near the servants' hall also hints at an accomplice. Suddenly, a sharp rap came at the door. The butler entered quietly, carrying a folded note. Lord Peter, this was found pinned to the kitchen door early this morning. Wimsey unfolded the note carefully. The handwriting was hurried and jagged. The truth lies not in shadows, but in the hands that feed the fire. Trust no one among the servants. Trimble frowned. A warning, or a threat? Wimsey's gaze sharpened. Indeed, someone is trying to intimidate those who might speak out. We must protect the honest staff, especially Charity and Edward. The afternoon waned, shadows lengthening as the investigation pressed on. Whimsy decided to conduct individual interviews with key household members, seeking the smallest detail that might have been overlooked. He first spoke with Miss Clara Withers, the head housekeeper. She was a stern woman, sharp-eyed and exacting, who managed the staff with a firm hand but fair heart. "Miss Withers," Whimsy began gently, "have you noticed any unusual behavior among the staff or strangers visiting the estate recently?" Clara's lips pressed thin. "There's been tension since the news of the missing funds. Some servants whisper of theft, and several have requested transfers, fearing wrongful blame, but I have no knowledge of any outsiders coming near the house." "Any conflicts involving Mr. Faraday?" Whimsy asked. She hesitated briefly. "Faraday is a difficult man, proud, quick to anger. He and Collins argued frequently over the estate's accounts. Some believe Faraday tried to shift blame onto Collins." Whimsy thanked her and moved next to the groundskeeper, Thomas Webb, a grizzled man with years of service to the estate. "Mr. Webb, have you seen anyone unusual on the grounds? Any strangers or suspicious activity?" Webb rubbed his chin. "Now that you mention it, I did see a man in a dark coat near the west wing, late yesterday. Looked out of place, skulking around near the tool shed." Whimsy's pulse quickened. "Did you recognize him?" "No, sir. I only caught a glimpse, but his gait was nervous, like he was up to no good." "Did you tell anyone?" "No, I thought it might be one of the new workers, but now I'm not so sure." "Thank you, Mr. Webb. Your vigilance is appreciated." With these confirmations of the stranger's presence, Whimsy's suspicion grew that the murder was part of a larger conspiracy, possibly involving more than just Faraday and Collins. As evening approached, Whimsy gathered Charity and Edward in the drawing room. "Both of you have shown great courage. I need you to be especially careful in the coming days. There are those who would see you silenced before the truth emerges." Charity's eyes were steady. "I'm not afraid, Lord Peter. Collins was a good man. He deserves justice." Edward nodded in agreement, though a shadow of fear lingered behind his resolve. Whimsy looked between them and then out the window, where the first stars began to glitter in the night sky. "We will expose whoever is behind this, but we must be patient and watchful." Just then, a sharp knock startled the group. The butler entered, breathless. "Lord Peter, Inspector Trimble has brought in a visitor, a Mr. Arthur Gainsborough. He claims to have urgent information about the estate and Mr. Collins." Whimsy's curiosity was immediate. "Show him in." Moments later, a tall, slender man stepped into the room, his dark eyes alert beneath neatly trimmed eyebrows. His appearance was that of a man accustomed to discretion and command. "Lord Peter Whimsy, Inspector Trimble," he said with a slight bow. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I'm Arthur Gainsborough, a solicitor representing a distant relative of the late Mr. Collins." Whimsy inclined his head politely. "Mr. Gainsborough, what brings you to Compton Abbey?" "There are matters concerning Mr. Collins' affairs that require immediate attention," Gainsborough replied gravely. "Before his disappearance, Mr. Collins entrusted me with documents that he believed would prove vital to clearing his name and implicating those responsible for the misappropriation of estate funds." Whimsy gestured toward the papers on the table. "We have found some of those ledgers, but it seems there is more." Gainsborough nodded. "Indeed, Collins feared for his life. He left instructions for these documents to be delivered to me if anything happened to him. I have them here." He produced a small locked case from his briefcase. Inspector Trimble took the case carefully. "May we see them?" Gainsborough opened the case, revealing several bundles of papers, detailed correspondence, and copies of financial statements. These include letters between Collins and a trusted friend, one who advised him to be cautious, and records of large sums unaccounted for in the estate's books, Gainsborough explained. Also, correspondence suggesting someone within the estate sought to discredit Collins by framing him for theft. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "This corroborates the threats and warnings we have encountered. it appears Collins was both investigator and target. As such, Gainsborough continued, I've come to assist in ensuring justice prevails. Whimsy stood, offering a hand. Your arrival is most timely, Mr. Gainsborough. Together, we shall unravel this knot. The tension in the room was palpable as the puzzle shifted yet again. The presence of these new documents and the solicitor's arrival signaled a turning point. The web of lies surrounding Collins' death was beginning to unravel, but the true architect of the crime still lurked in the shadows. Whimsy allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. The night may be long, but truth has a habit of finding the light. Tomorrow we will follow these new leads with all the care and thoroughness they demand. Outside, the wind whispered through the ancient trees, carrying secrets that would soon be revealed. Within Compton Abbey, the game was far from over, and Lord Peter Whimsy was ready to play his final hand. The weight of the night at Compton Abbey seemed to deepen, pressing down on its inhabitants with an almost tangible intensity. The arrival of Arthur Gainsborough had brought a fresh but fragile hope to Lord Peter Whimsy and Inspector Trimble. The solicitor's documents hinted at a conspiracy that went beyond mere theft or a moment of rage, suggesting a calculated effort to ruin Collins and cover a deeper betrayal within the estate's ranks. As the group lingered in the drawing room, the glow of the fire cast long shadows on the walls, flickering over the worried faces of those present. Whimsy carefully examined the new documents Gainsborough had produced. Letters, account books, and confidential correspondences, each page layered with implications that stretched far beyond the immediate tragedy. There was a methodical precision to the embezzlement, and the letters detailed a persistent effort to mask financial irregularities while diverting suspicion onto Collins himself. The pattern is clear, Whimsy said softly. Collins was gathering evidence, enough to expose someone with access and influence within the estate. His enemies feared exposure and chose to act before he could bring the matter to light. Inspector Trimble nodded. We need to identify who stood to gain most from silencing Collins. Indeed, Gainsborough agreed. The estate has been mismanaged for years, and someone has profited handsomely. I believe these papers will lead us to the culprit. Whimsy closed the leather case gently and looked up at the small group. But we cannot underestimate the danger we face. The murderer is still among us, and likely watching. We must proceed cautiously and keep the household under close observation. The solicitor's arrival had injected urgency into the investigation, but also heightened tension among the staff. Word had already begun to spread, and suspicion lurked behind every glance. To protect the integrity of the inquiry, Whimsy arranged for a discreet but constant watch over key household members and for interviews to continue with anyone who might hold a clue. The next morning dawned cold and misty, the gardens around Compton Abbey shrouded in a damp grey veil. Whimsy, accompanied by Inspector Trimble and Charity Boothroyd, began a thorough review of the evidence and testimonies, determined to build a timeline that could narrow the possibilities. Let us start with the argument between Faraday and Collins, Whimsy suggested, and trace all movements until the moment Collins fell. Charity, her keen eyes bright despite the weariness, nodded. I can help with the servants' accounts. I have been discreetly speaking with them, and there are details that might not have seemed important at first. Together, they pieced together a sequence. Collins and Faraday had quarreled in the tool shed late in the afternoon, witnessed in part by Edward Winstanley, who had fled before things escalated further. After the altercation, Faraday's torn coat sleeve and missing button suggested a scuffle, matching the evidence found on the murder weapon. Yet Faraday's claim that he discovered Collins collapsed near the pavilion raised questions about the exact timing. Where were the others during this time? Whimsy asked. Who could have intervened or witnessed events? Trimble recounted the reports. Most servants were occupied with evening preparations. Clara Withers, the housekeeper, was managing kitchen staff. Groundskeeper Webb was performing his rounds, but reported seeing a mysterious man near the west wing. which aligns with Charity's account of the voices near the servants' quarters, Whimsy said thoughtfully. The presence of this stranger is a key piece. We must identify him. The solicitor, Arthur Gainsborough, was tasked with reviewing the estate's records alongside Whimsy, searching for clues that might indicate who had the means and opportunity to manipulate the accounts. They discovered a series of letters exchanged between Collins and a trusted friend, revealing that Collins had recently received anonymous threats warning him to stop digging into the estate's finances. Someone knew Collins was close to the truth and wanted him silenced, Gainsborough observed grimly. That afternoon, Whimsy summoned Faraday once more to the study, determined to press him with newfound evidence. "Mr. Faraday," Whimsy began, his voice steady yet firm, "these documents and witness statements have confirmed your involvement in theft and confrontation with Mr. Collins. Your torn sleeve and missing button were found at the scene. You admit to being near the pavilion, but your story about discovering Mr. Collins after the fact strains credulity." Faraday's face tightened, and he clenched his fists beneath the desk. "I did what I had to. Collins threatened me, but I did not kill him." "Then who else could have?" Whimsy asked sharply. Faraday hesitated, eyes darting away. "I don't know, but I heard voices. 2 men talking about making it look like Collins was guilty." "Did you recognize either voice?" "No. One was harsh, angry, the other quieter, cautious." Whimsy exchanged a look with Trimble. The possibility of accomplices or conspirators expanded the investigation's scope considerably. "You will remain here in the house under guard," Whimsy said finally. "Any attempt to flee will be taken as guilt." With Faraday confined, Whimsy turned back to the staff, continuing to gather fragments of conversation, glances, and small inconsistencies. Edward Winstanley's earlier admission of witnessing the quarrel proved crucial, but he remained fearful of implicating others. "Edward," Whimsy said one evening, "you have done well to speak honestly. But I must ask, did you notice anything unusual about the stranger seen near the west wing? Anything that might help identify him?" Edward shook his head. "Only that he moved like someone used to hiding. I didn't see his face." Charity, standing nearby, chimed in. "Some of the younger servants mentioned a man who often came around the village nearby asking questions about the estate. He's been seen loitering near the servants' entrance in recent weeks." Whimsy's mind worked rapidly. "We must find this man. If he is involved, his presence may unravel the entire plot." Meanwhile, Arthur Gainsborough continued to sift through the papers, uncovering further evidence of financial manipulation, including forged signatures and doctored ledgers. The fraud was systematic and extensive, implicating someone with access to the estate's inner workings. Then came an unexpected breakthrough. Groundskeeper Webb returned with a small, battered notebook he claimed to have found discarded near the west wing. Whimsy carefully examined it under lamplight. The notebook contained a series of coded entries and sketches, a map of the estate, notes on patrol timings, and a list of names with figures beside them. The handwriting matched that of Faraday's, but some pages seemed to have been added or altered recently. "This may be the key to uncovering who helped Faraday or who pushed him to desperation," Whimsy said. The evidence pointed toward a shadowy figure manipulating events from behind the scenes. Was it a member of the staff, a distant relative, or someone outside the household with a vendetta? Days stretched on as Whimsy, Trimble, and Gainsborough worked tirelessly. The tension among the staff grew palpable, many anxious for the truth, but afraid of the consequences. One evening, Whimsy received a note slipped under his door, a crude warning to cease the investigation or face harm. Rather than intimidation, it steeled his resolve. "We tread a dangerous path," he told Trimble, "but justice demands we follow it to the end." That night, Whimsy and Charity staked out the servants' hall, watching and listening for signs of activity. As the clock neared midnight, muffled voices drifted through the corridor, low, hurried, urgent. Whimsy motioned Charity to silence and crept toward the door. Through a crack, he glimpsed Faraday speaking with a shadowy figure, the stranger reported by the servants. Their words were indistinct, but the tone was tense. Suddenly, the stranger produced a small package and pressed it into Faraday's hands. Whimsy's heart quickened. "Whatever your role," Whimsy whispered to Charity, "we are on the cusp of unveiling the truth." As the two men parted and the stranger slipped away into the darkness, Whimsy stepped forward, revealing himself. "Mr. Faraday," he said quietly but firmly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy and murder." Faraday's shoulders sagged, and he made no attempt to resist. The stranger's identity remained a mystery for the moment, but Whimsy knew the trap had closed. With the conspirator in custody and the documents exposing a web of deceit laid bare, the shadows began to lift from Compton Abbey. The truth behind Colin's death and the estate's corruption would soon be known, and justice, long delayed, would finally be served. The dawn broke with a fragile calm over the ancient grounds, the promise of resolution shimmering in the cool morning air. Lord Peter Whimsy, steadfast and unyielding, prepared to face the final steps of an investigation that had tested the very limits of patience and perseverance. The game was nearly won, and the final move awaited. The drawing room at Compton Abbey was charged with a stillness that felt less like peace and more like the poised moment before a storm's last thunderclap. Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the hearth, a faint curl of smoke drifting from his cigarette, his expression one of amused detachment. Around him, the assembled household awaited the conclusion of a drama that had unfolded with all the intricate cruelty of a Jacobean tragedy. Whimsy began with a slow, deliberate clarity that seemed to draw the very air taut. It is a truth universally acknowledged, though rarely admitted aloud, that those who keep secrets in country houses are often their own worst enemies. He gestured toward Faraday, seated with an uncharacteristic pallor. Mr. Faraday's guilt is undeniable, not only of theft, but of conspiring to silence Mr. Collins. Yet, as is so often the case, the solution lies not in the act alone, but in the labyrinthine motives behind it. Whimsy paced slightly, then fixed his gaze on Clara Withers, the housekeeper. "Miss Withers, you have maintained that you saw nothing unusual the day of Mr. Collins' death, yet your sudden disappearance during the critical hour, coupled with the discovery of altered records in your domain, suggested otherwise." A faint color rose in Clara's cheeks, but she remained silent. "More telling still," Whimsy continued, "was your intimate knowledge of the estate's accounts. Your hand was not merely in maintaining order among the servants, but in facilitating the forgery of documents to cover the embezzlement. When Collins began his investigations, you panicked, acting out of loyalty to those you served, or perhaps fear for your own position." He turned to the solicitor, Gainsborough. "And you, Mr. Gainsborough, provided vital corroboration that the financial manipulations were orchestrated with precision, but it was the clues in the notebook, notes not penned by Faraday, but by another hand, that ultimately unraveled the conspiracy." Whimsy's eyes rested on Edward Winstanley, the nervous young footman. "Edward, it was you who left that notebook near the West Wing, hoping to draw attention to the plot you feared. Your courage deserves recognition, even if it came too late to save Mr. Collins." The room held its breath as Whimsy stepped back and slowly folded his hands. The killer's mistake was one of timing and presumption. They assumed Mr. Collins would be found at the Croquet Lawn, the scene of the staged scream. But the true moment of death occurred elsewhere, a fact revealed by the misaligned clocks and soundproof doors I questioned at length. He smiled thinly. And thus, the seemingly irrelevant observations, the misplaced salver, the curtains drawn at odd hours, the echoing church bells, were in truth the threads that led to the whole tapestry. The housekeeper, defeated, finally spoke, her voice trembling with weary resignation. "Yes, I did what I thought necessary to protect the family and myself. But I never intended murder. It was meant to frighten Collins, not end him. Whimsy nodded. A fatal miscalculation, Miss Withers. Justice, however, requires full account, even of unintended consequences. Inspector Trimble moved forward to take her into custody, while the others exchanged glances heavy with relief and sorrow. As the household began to settle from the shock, Whimsy lit another cigarette and regarded the ancient walls with a glint of sardonic satisfaction. Compton Abbey, like all country houses, keeps its secrets well, he remarked softly. But one finds that even the deepest shadows cannot hide from a well-tuned mind armed with patience and a penchant for noticing the trivial. With a final glance at the faces around him, he quoted lightly, "All's well that ends well, though, one might add, only after considerable inconvenience and several ruined shirts." And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy turned toward the door, his footsteps echoing softly as he departed into the morning mist, leaving behind a household cleansed but forever marked by the darkness that had passed through.